It's strange how rain can make you feel safe, like the storm is loud enough to hide you from the world. But sometimes, the rain stops. And that's when you realize you were never alone out there to begin with. Tonight's stories are 100% true, verified through public records and real witness accounts. Some names have been changed to protect privacy, but every event you're about to hear actually happened. Real forests, real nights, real people who thought they were by themselves. If you feel that quiet chill creeping in, take a second to like this video. Your like helps this story reach more horror lovers like you. And comment where you're watching from. You're part of my horror family, and I want to know where my family's watching from. When it's over, tell me which story hit you the hardest. And subscribe, because your support fuels this channel to bring you even more terrifying true stories. I went camping alone that weekend because I needed the quiet. Work had been eating at me for months, and my apartment in Lexington felt smaller every day. So I drove east, past Moorhead, and deeper toward the Daniel Boone National Forest, where the mountains start to fold in on themselves and cell service drops to nothing. By the time I reached the small campground off a gravel spur near Cave Run Lake, it was already raining. Not a storm, just steady October rain, the kind that soaks into everything. The campground was nearly empty. Most of the summer crowd was long gone. A wooden sign listed 10 sites looping around a small clearing bordered by hardwoods and pine. Leaves were halfway turned, burnt orange and wet brown, plastered against the asphalt road. I saw only one other vehicle, an older RV parked at the far end of the loop, tucked beneath a cluster of sycamores. No lights on inside, no chairs outside, just sitting there, rain streaking down its sides. I chose a site on the opposite end, closer to the tree line. I liked the feeling of having woods behind me. It felt less exposed. By the time I pitched my tent, the ground was already soft. My boots sank slightly into the mud as I tightened the stakes. The rain tapped lightly on the nylon overhead, a constant dull percussion. I made a small meal under the awning and watched fog start to gather between the trees as evening fell. The mountains around the hollow disappeared early, swallowed by low cloud. Around 9 p.m., I noticed how quiet it was, apart from the rain. No laughter, no distant engines, no music from the RV, just water and the occasional rustle of wind through branches. I told myself that was the point. I crawled into my tent around 10:30. The air inside smelled like damp fabric and cold earth. I could hear water trickling somewhere downhill, probably runoff collecting in a drainage dip near the road. I lay on my back, listening to the steady rhythm overhead. Sometime after midnight, the rain intensified. It went from a tap to a roar. Heavy drops hammered against the tent so loudly I could barely hear my own breathing. The sound flattened everything else. It felt like being sealed inside a drum. I don't know what made me unzip the tent flap. Maybe it was the way the wind shifted. Or maybe it was just instinct. Some part of me checking my surroundings the way you do when you're alone. I shined my flashlight downward first. That's when I saw them. Footprints, not mine. They circled the tent in a slow arc, pressed deep into the mud. The rain had softened the ground, so each step was clear and heavy. They weren't there earlier. I would have noticed. I'd walked the perimeter twice before turning in. These prints were fresh. They made a complete circle, and then they stopped, directly behind where my head had been resting inside the tent. I felt my throat tighten. I crouched there in the doorway longer than I should have, rain soaking into my sleeves. I told myself they were older, just revealed by the shifting mud. Maybe someone had walked through before the storm picked up. Maybe the RV owner. But the spacing was wrong. The steps were measured, controlled. I backed into the tent slowly and zipped it shut. My heartbeat felt louder than the rain. I lay down again, staring at the tent wall inches from my face. The rain was so loud, it felt protective at first, like it could drown out anything. Then I heard something that didn't match it. Movement, slow, deliberate. Not the erratic shuffle of an animal, not the quick light steps of a deer. This was paced, careful. A step, pause, another step. I held my breath, straining to separate the sound from the rain. My chest barely moved. The air inside the tent felt too thin. The movement traced the same arc as the footprints. Around me. It stopped again near my head. There was no scratching, no voice, no zipper pulling, just presence. I told myself if it were a person, they would have said something. Asked if I was okay, apologized, but they didn't. After a long time, maybe minutes, maybe an hour, the sound faded back into the steady roar of rain. I didn't sleep. I stayed awake until the gray of morning began to seep through the nylon overhead. And all the while, I tried to convince myself that I hadn't just been circled in the dark. The rain eased just before dawn. When I finally unzipped the tent, the air outside felt colder than it had the night before. The forest looked rinsed clean, leaves plastered to the road, fog hanging low between trunks like smoke that hadn't decided where to settle. The footprints were still there, clearer now in the softer light. They were larger than mine, deeper. Whoever made them had stood still for a few seconds behind my tent. The mud compressed harder in that one spot. I followed them with my eyes as they moved away. They didn't head toward the woods. They led toward the loop road, toward the RV. My stomach felt hollow. I stood there longer than I should have, telling myself I was overreacting. Maybe the person had checked on me during the storm. Maybe they thought I needed help. The RV sat exactly where I'd seen it the night before. Or so I thought. As I walked closer, something felt wrong. There were no tire tracks in the mud leading to it. The gravel around the site was disturbed from the rain, but there was no clear impression of heavy wheels having settled there overnight. No leveling blocks, no damp footprints around its door, and the windows were darker than I remembered. I stopped about 20 feet away. The space was empty, completely empty, no RV, no vehicle at all. Just a rectangular patch of flattened gravel where something heavy might have been parked days ago. I felt my pulse in my ears. I scanned the road. The rain had softened everything. If an RV had left that morning, there would have been tracks. Mud churned up, gravel displaced. There was nothing. I walked back to my site slowly. My tent looked smaller than it had before. Exposed. The footprints in the mud led from the edge of the road to my tent and back again. But they didn't continue past the loop. They just faded, lost in the wash of rain. I packed up quickly. My hands felt clumsy as I folded damp fabric and shoved it into the trunk. The forest seemed quieter now than it had the night before. Even the birds were absent. On my way out, I stopped at the ranger station near the highway. It was a small wooden building with a sagging porch and a faded Smokey Bear poster in the window. A middle-aged ranger sat behind the desk, flipping through paperwork. I told him about the footprints first. Then I mentioned the RV. He frowned slightly and pulled up the campground registry. "No one's checked in with an RV this week," he said. "Just you." I felt something tighten behind my ribs. "Could someone have just parked there?" I asked. He shook his head. "Gate's been locked at night for the off-season. You'd have seen it open." I didn't know what to say after that. I drove back toward Lexington with the heater on full blast, even though it wasn't that cold. The mountains in my rearview mirror looked the same as they always had. Layered ridges, mist settling into hollows, trees bending slightly in the wind. But I couldn't stop thinking about the spacing of those steps, the pause behind my head, the way the movement had felt patient. It's been a year now. I still camp. I still go back to the mountains. But I don't choose isolated loop roads anymore. And I don't ignore the feeling that someone might be standing just beyond the edge of sound. Sometimes when rain hits my apartment windows hard enough, I wake up with that same tightness in my chest. And I picture mud pressed deep with the weight of someone who stood there for a long time. Listening. I chose that campground because it was small and usually overlooked. It sits off a narrow Forest Service road not far from Paintsville Lake, tucked into a shallow hollow where the hills fold close and the air feels heavier than it should. Most people head toward the larger sites closer to the marina, but this one only has 6 clearings spaced unevenly along the water. No hookups, no lights, just a gravel lot and a weathered sign that leans slightly to one side. It had been raining since I left Pikeville that afternoon. Not a hard rain, just steady, gray, Appalachian rain that settles in and refuses to move on. By the time I parked, fog was already drifting low across the surface of the lake, turning it into a sheet of dull silver. There were no other cars in the lot. I noticed that immediately. The gravel was undisturbed except for my own tire tracks. No fresh mud, no boot prints. Just the rain tapping softly against my windshield and the distant hum of water spilling over the dam somewhere beyond the trees. I told myself that was the point. I needed the quiet. I'd been having trouble sleeping for months. Ever since my divorce, really. The apartment in town felt crowded with memories, even after I boxed most of them away. I thought a night alone in the mountains might clear my head. I set up my tent near the tree line, about 20 feet from the lake's edge. The ground was soft, damp from days of rain, and my stakes sank easily into the mud. The air smelled like wet leaves and rotten wood. Every so often, a fish broke the surface of the lake with a hollow plop. I built a small fire under a patch of overhanging branches. It struggled at first, smoke clinging low and bitter, but eventually it caught. I sat there in my rain jacket, watching the flames curl around the damp wood, listening to the forest settle into night. By 9 p.m., the rain picked up. It started as a steady patter, then deepened into something heavier. The trees swayed in slow arcs, leaves shivering. The lake disappeared behind a curtain of gray. I crawled into my tent around 10:30, leaving the fire to die out in its ring of stones. The inside of the tent smelled faintly of nylon and damp earth. I zipped the flap shut and lay back on my sleeping pad, listening. Rain on fabric is different than rain on leaves. It's closer, louder. It feels like being inside a drum. Around midnight, the storm intensified. Thunder rolled somewhere over the ridge. Not sharp, but constant, like a low growl that never fully faded. Lightning flickered behind the tent walls, turning the nylon briefly translucent before plunging it back into darkness. I wasn't asleep. I'd been drifting, but not sleeping. At some point after 1 a.m., I turned on my headlamp to check the time. The small beam cut through the dim interior, casting sharp shadows along the seams of the tent. I angled it toward the mesh window out of habit, just to see if the rain was letting up. That's when I saw it. A shadow. It stood between two trees about 20 yards away. At first I thought it was a trunk bending in the wind, but it didn't move with the branches. It was vertical. Still, the beam of my headlamp caught the shape at its edge, just enough to outline something darker than the rain behind it. I held the light steady. It didn't react. It didn't shift like a deer startled in the open. It didn't lower its head or step sideways. It just stood there. The rain was so loud I couldn't hear anything else. It swallowed all other sound. No footsteps, no breathing, just water hammering against nylon and leaves. Lightning flashed again. For a split second, the forest turned white. The shape was closer, not dramatically, just a few steps nearer than before. I told myself that was my imagination. The distortion of rain and light, the way shadows stretch and warp when you're tired. I kept the beam on it, my hand trembling slightly. Another flash, closer, still motionless but closer. My throat felt dry. I shut off my headlamp. The darkness rushed in immediately, thick and absolute. Without the beam, the world outside the tent ceased to exist. I lay there, heart pounding so hard it felt like it might shake the fabric around me. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of perspective, a tree shifting in the storm. But I didn't turn the light back on. I lay in the dark, listening to the rain pound the forest flat, wondering if something was standing just beyond the edge of the tent, close enough to touch. I didn't sleep. I stayed still until the rain softened near dawn. My body ached from lying rigid for hours, afraid to move in case the sound of my shifting would invite something closer. When the storm finally eased, it left behind that heavy Appalachian silence, the kind that feels padded and unnatural, as if the mountains are holding their breath. Gray morning light seeped through the tent walls. I unzipped the flap slowly. The forest looked rinsed clean. Leaves plastered to the ground. Mist rising off the lake in slow curls. The air smelled metallic, like soaked stone. There was nothing standing between the trees. No movement, no obvious disturbance. I stepped out carefully, boots sinking slightly into mud. My fire pit was cold and drowned, ashes smeared into paste. The clearing looked as empty as it had the night before. I almost convinced myself it had been exhaustion, stress, my mind filling in shapes where there were none. Then I walked around the back of the tent. There, pressed into the wet earth, just beyond the rear guy lines, were 3 cigarette butts. They were fresh. The filters were still faintly yellow at the ends, paper not yet fully broken down by rain. Each one had been pushed deliberately into the mud, twisted slightly as if ground in by a boot. They formed a small arc. Facing the tent, my stomach dropped. I don't smoke. I never have. And I checked the site carefully before setting up. I'm particular like that. I don't like trash near where I sleep. I scanned the ground around me. There were no clear footprints. The rain had erased most impressions, but the cigarette butts remained, stubborn and deliberate. I looked toward the gravel lot. Still no other cars. No tire tracks besides my own. The surface of the lot was smooth, except for the shallow ruts my sedan had left the evening before. I stood there longer than I should have, trying to piece it together. Someone could have walked in. From the road, from a trail I hadn't noticed. But why stand there? Why not approach? Why not say something? I thought about the shadow between the trees, the way it hadn't moved like wildlife, the way lightning had revealed it, inching closer without visible steps. The cigarettes suggested patience, waiting, watching. I packed up quickly. My hands felt stiff and clumsy as I collapsed the tent, shaking off water and mud. I kept glancing over my shoulder toward the tree line, half expecting to see someone step out and explain it all with an awkward laugh. No one did. As I drove back down the narrow forest road, tires slipping slightly in the mud, I kept replaying the night in my head. The beam of my headlamp, the shape holding still, the flashes of lightning closing the distance. I stopped once along the shoulder to check something. I turned off the engine and sat there, listening. No wind, no engines. Just the faint drip of water from branches overhead. For a moment, I considered going back, asking around in town, reporting it. But what would I say? That I'd seen a shadow in the rain? That someone smoked 3 cigarettes behind my tent and left no other trace? It sounded thin even in my own mind. I went home instead. I threw away the cigarette butts in a gas station trash can outside Prestonsburg. I don't know why I'd picked them up in the first place. Maybe I needed proof that they were real. Sometimes, late at night, when rain hits my apartment windows hard enough, I think about that clearing by the lake. The way the storm made the world feel sealed off from everything else. I think about how close that shape had gotten before I turned off the light. And I wonder, if I'd kept the beam on just a little longer, would it have stepped forward?
If today's story touched a quiet corner of your heart, if for a moment you felt like someone was standing close to you, then remember you are not alone. To hear more terrifying whisper in the depth of the night, subscribe to our channel Night Mare Whisper, because every story is not just about fear, it leaves behind a feeling. Thanks for watching, and one more thing, we'll meet again tomorrow night when the darkness has grown a little deeper.